All right, that must mean it's 10 o'clock. So welcome everybody. Welcome to Conversations About Carbon. It's a webinar series where you get to learn more about carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics within agricultural systems. And it's run by the ISU Bioeconomy Institute in collaboration with the ISU College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Excited to have you today, and I'm excited to be able to interview our special guest, Dr. Ranga Appuhamy. So Ranga is an assistant professor in animal science here at Iowa State who focuses on dairy nutrition. Prior to coming to ISU, he's got a bachelor's degree from the University of Peradeniya. I hope I got that close at least, in Sri Lanka. Master's and PhDs at Virginia Tech and postdocs at the University of Guelph and UC Davis. So lots of great academic background. He teaches animal nutrition, dairy systems management, among other topics at Iowa State. He advises clubs, he advises students, he does research. There's just so much that Dr. Appuhamy does. Really impressed with your resume. And today we're going to talk about feeding cows to mitigate methane emissions sustainably. Of course, methane being a potent greenhouse gas that's received so much attention this past fall with the COP climate conference in Glasgow, and in the last year with a lot of focus on it by industry as well as by government. So we're excited to learn more about this topic and how it connects with animal agriculture. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that folks can see the both of us. And so just to kind of get us started, I'll ask questions for about 20 minutes. We'll have a discussion and then we'll open it up to our audience, encourage the audience to pose questions in the chat, and I can moderate them with Dr. Appuhamy. So the first question is, given the broad public audience that we have for Conversations About Carbon, I'm hoping that you can just give us a broad overview of some of the carbon dynamics associated with animal agriculture. And when I say carbon, I mean CO2e, so CO2 equivalents. So thinking about greenhouse gas broadly.
Yeah. Before jumping into greenhouse gases, I would like to briefly describe some basic characteristics of animal agriculture, because the animal agriculture can be practiced in two ways. Okay, in one way, we confine animals to a house and bring feed to the animal. So we call that kind of system a confinement animal feeding operations. The other system, the animals spend most of their time outside and seek for feed in pasture or a croplands or a rangeland. So we call that a grazing system. So since most of our animals are in confinement systems, particularly in the US and particularly in the Iowa, I'm going to focus basically on the confinement agriculture, animal agriculture today. So that is one characteristic I want to kind of give a brief description. The second characteristic is we use two types of animals: ruminant animals and non-ruminant animals. Okay, the ruminant animals include beef cattle, dairy cattle, sheep and goat basically. And when it comes to non-ruminant animals, we have swine or pigs and poultry. Okay, so the ruminant animals are given that name because they have a large compartment in their digestive tract called rumen, which is very close to the mouth. And this rumen possesses a huge population of bacteria and other microorganisms. So these microorganisms digest majority of the nutrient, particularly fiber, in the ruminant, because the ruminants are herbivores, so they eat forages. That means they consume large amount of fiber. So these microorganisms break down those fiber in a process, namely fermentation. So this fermentation process produces methane in the rumen. So when the animal burp, because now I told you that the rumen is close to the mouth, right? So then they burp and then the methane come out of come into the environment and release to the atmosphere. Okay, so that is the ruminal methane production, very briefly. And the ruminant animals also have some a microbial population in the hind side or the back side of their digestion in the large intestine. So when undigested and the feed that were not broken down in the rumen and other parts, when they move into the large intestine, and again microorganisms again ferment those nutrients, particularly again fiber, and produce methane, and then that methane come out to the environment when they pass gases. Okay, so then we have the front side and the back side emissions, but all produced within the digestive tract. So since they are produced within the so that methane is produced within the digestive tract, we call it enteric methane. So enteric methane emissions. So that is one major component of greenhouse gas emissions in animal agriculture. So since rumen is a huge compartment and large amount of very kind of fresh food moving into the rumen, so the rumen produce the large amount of methane compared to the methane produced in the large intestine. So in ruminants, for example, in cattle, the amount of methane produced in the large intestine or the hindgut is 1/20th of the methane produced in the rumen. So the rumen is a major contributor to the enteric methane emissions in ruminant. Okay, so actually if you go to the national the statistics, the beef and dairy cattle are the major enteric methane emitters. They contribute 97% of the enteric methane emissions in the US. Okay, and then we cannot forget the swine and poultry too, because they also have a large intestine. They do not have a rumen, that is why we call them non-ruminant animals, but they still have that. Humans and all the animals, high-level animals, have this large intestine. So the poultry and swine also have large intestine. They also ferment some amount of nutrients, and they also produce some enteric methane, but again, it's very small amount. At national level, swine and poultry contribute only 2% of the total enteric methane emissions from animal agriculture. But when it comes to Iowa, then we see that the non-ruminant, particularly swine, contribute largely to our total enteric methane emission because of we have large population of swine relative to our cattle population. So when it comes to Iowa, the enteric methane emission calculated enteric, I would say it may not be the absolute truth, but whatever the data we have indicate that the swine population can contribute about 14% of the total enteric methane emissions. Okay, so far we have been talking about the methane produced inside the digestive tract and finally eventually emitted into the atmosphere. Okay, so and then again, both ruminant and non-ruminant animal produce feces and urine. We collectively call them manure. Okay, again, in confinement animal agriculture, those manure is collected and stored in a particular way until they are disposed or they are applied on land. Okay, so methane is also produced during this manure storage. Okay, so the manure from different animals can produce different amounts of methane. However, the way we handle and store manure has a huge or significant impact on the amount of methane produced from manure. Okay, so basically we handle manure in two ways. We handle manure as a liquid or solid. Okay, so depending on this type of whether it's going to be a liquid or solid storage, the methane emissions going to be significantly different. Okay, so the liquid manure storage emit more methane because the liquid provide favorable condition again for the fermentation, because the fermentation is the reactions producing methane. Whenever there's a favorable condition for the fermentation, we see production of methane. So the liquid when there's a lot of liquid, it creates anaerobic oxygen-free environment in the manure that promote fermentation. So we see a production of significant amount of methane from liquid manure compared to solid manure. Okay, so and then the liquid manure is the major manure storage system for swine and dairy, and the solid is the major form of manure we commonly see in poultry and feedlot cattle. Okay, so and again, if you go to the national statistic, so the dairy manure contribute to 52% of the manure methane emissions. Okay, and then actually when if you go back to the enteric methane, the non-ruminant animals like swine and poultry contribute only 2% of the national enteric emissions. But when it comes to the manure emission, it is much greater. Their contribution is close to 40%. Okay, so but again, when you come to Iowa, because since we have huge non-ruminant like poultry and swine population relative to the ruminant population, the manure methane emission contribution exceed even 80% in Iowa from the swine and poultry farm. So overall, you see that there's a significant difference between the national emissions and the state-specific emissions, indicating maybe we need a state-specific policies and strategies to mitigate emissions. Some kind of a small take-home message from that comparison between the national emissions and the statewide emission. Anyway, so we have touched two types of emissions. One is enteric emissions, methane emissions, and manure methane emission. Okay, so we have been talking about only methane so far, but there's another greenhouse gas, which is nitrous oxide, originating from animal manure. Okay, so the methane, and we all know that it's a powerful greenhouse gas, 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, if we estimate that warming power over 100-year period. But if you calculate that warming power within short period of time, for example, 20 years time, the methane has even more power, like 80 times more power than carbon dioxide. Okay, so but anyway, overall, it's a powerful greenhouse gas. But when it comes to nitrous oxide, it's even more powerful in terms of their warming power, or more technically, we call global warming potential, or GWP. So it is 10 times more powerful than methane. That means it is almost 300 more powerful times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Okay, so again, depending on the livestock species, the manure can emit different amounts of nitrous oxide depending on the nitrogen content in the diet, because nitrous oxide, as name implies, it has nitrogen and oxygen. It is a nitrogen containing gas. So if you have more nitrogen in manure, it has a more chance to produce more nitrous oxide. Okay, and again, the way we handle manure has a huge role to play in determining the amount of nitrous oxide emitted to the environment. Opposite to the methane emission, because we saw that liquid manure produces more methane than solid manure. But when it comes to nitrous oxide production, solid manure produce, that means the manure from poultry and feedlot cattle can produce more nitrous oxide than the liquid manure, which is the swine and dairy manure. Okay, so okay, so somebody, are we going to later we answer that question, or right now?
Yeah, so I'm going to stop you there. That was great in terms of sort of basics. One thing I realized I forgot to introduce myself for those that don't know me. I'm Dr. Lisa Schulte Moore. I'm a faculty member here at Iowa State in the Natural Resource Ecology and Management Department, and then also Associate Director of the Bioeconomy Institute, along with Robert Brown. We've been co-hosting these conversations about carbon series. And yeah, so excited to be able to talk to you with Dr. Ranga Appuhamy. So my next question, okay, so those statistics are great, just kind of understanding where the greenhouse gases are associated with animal agriculture and how they vary among species. So the next question, you kind of talked a little bit about some of the manure management, but given your expertise, let's focus on the animal for now. And so there's a lot of discussion, even raised to the level of sort of general news about the opportunity for feed additives. So my question is, what do we know about feed additives and their ability to reduce greenhouse gases? And how does that stack up as an option in comparison to some other things that might be done to reduce emissions associated with animal agriculture?
Okay, so I mean, again, I give you some very brief introduction to strategies that we have to reduce emissions very quick. So there are three classes of strategies. One is microbial strategy. That means we try to control methane produced in microorganisms. For example, the New Zealand has tested vaccines, but the results are inconclusive, but they have tested that one, whether we can inhibit particularly that microorganisms produce in methane in the rumen, okay? And the other one is some genetic selecting animals that produce less methane. Again, we need more research to kind of conclude on the success of those techniques, but by far the most successful strategies are related to the nutrition, okay? Feed additives and basic modification of nutrient composition, okay? So the nutrition strategies, we have two things. One is manipulation of amount of fiber, starch, fat. That is the basic nutrient composition. That also one strategy. The other is the feed additive, because feed additive is not a nutrient. That is another additional chemical that we added to the diet. So because your question is about feed additives, I will talk about the feed additives. So the feed additives, we usually use feed additives to enhance appetite of the animal. So the animal will eat and produce more. Or the other major objective is to improve the efficiency of utilizing nutrients. It is not a feed additive, it's not a nutrient, but it can improve the utilization of nutrients to produce milk, meat, and egg, okay? Mm-hmm. So, but that is our original idea of adding feed additives. But with these environmental concerns associated with animal agriculture, we started producing some feed additives specifically inhibited methane emissions, or sometimes some feed additives has an additional advantage of decreasing emission. Good example is monensin. So the monensin is widely used, according to Dr. Dan Loy, more than 95% of the feedlot produced in Iowa daily feed monensin in the diet. So the monensin is originally utilized to improve energy efficiency, control bloat, and also improve the rumen function, okay? But the recent research, actually I did an analysis and found that the monensin can reduce the enteric methane emissions of cattle by 10%. Okay. So, and then we also have some feed additives specifically manufactured to reduce methane emissions. Good example is 3-nitroxypropanol or 3-NOP, okay? So this feed additive is the only feed additive so far has shown very consistent reduction in methane emission, 30 to 40% reduction across several experiments. The reduction is very persistent. It doesn't sacrifice production, milk production or meat production, which is very important. No strategy is sustainable if it is going to sacrifice the production, because reducing greenhouse gas emission is just one sustainable goal. There are so many other sustainable goals. We need to make the animal industry economically viable and profitable. So that means we cannot sacrifice the production. And in the global basis, we have a huge sustainable goal, which is achieving zero hunger by 2030. So we cannot sacrifice animal protein production. So the NOP, very consistent in decreasing methane emission, and also it doesn't affect the production. So that is very sustainable. But the downside of that is because it is still waiting for the FDA full approval to utilize in commercial farms. All the information we have right now about 3 NOP is coming from experiments, like a research settings, not any commercial farms. So I'm very optimistic that if we will get the FDA approval, and that's going to be have a huge impact on particularly achieving this zero net greenhouse gas emission goals that we are going to achieve.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that with that. As you were talking, I was like, okay, that sounds all great. What's the downside? And so, still in research trials. Is there any concerns about sort of meat quality with that as well? Or
yes, that is actually concern of FDA, any residual that is going to the human food chains. So I think we have data showing that there's no or negligible residuals deposited in meat and milk. So I mean, that is why we are optimistic that we would get the approval.
Okay, sounds good. And one of the things that has been in the news, of course, is the seaweed.
Oh, yeah.
Can you speak to that just briefly?
Yeah, the seaweed, again, it is limited to experiments at the moment. There are experiments taking place in Australia and in the US, particularly the UC Davis and Penn State, 2 groups kind of, testing kind of 2 different species of seaweed. Actually, feeding seaweed is not a novelty, because the history book says that in 100 BC, the seaweed was fed to cattle in Greece. So, I mean, like because people recognize the seaweed is a very nutritious. There's a wide array of nutrients. The chemical analysis says that it improved production. So that is why because people didn't think about the greenhouse emissions in 100 BC, I believe. So so it's basically that is the nutrient supplement. But our experiments again found even, I mean, beyond the reduction we achieved with 3 NOP, I mean, the seaweed decreased the methane production even up to 98% in one of the experiments conducted in Australia. But the thing is, the results are very variable from Australia to UC Davis to Penn State, maybe because of the dosage they use. And also they have used different species, because seaweeds can be red, green, blue, and even in red, they have different species. So, and then they have different concentration of active ingredient, which is a bromoform, which is the inhibitor of methane emissions. So the experimental data is very promising overall, even though it's variable, but it's promising. But then again, everything, all the data, all the efforts are limited to the research settings or the experiments so far. So again, the challenges now, again, we need to get the FDA approval. So FDA limits the utilization of seaweed to feed livestock or even human populations if they want, because the bromoform belongs to a chemical category called trihalomethane, and the FDA has a very strict threshold for that chemical in drinking water and other beverages, including milk. So we need more data to see the residue levels, tissue and the residue levels in milk and meat. I mean, to prove that negligible concentrations will go into the human food chain. That's a one challenge. The second challenge is producing or manufacturing a continuous supply of adequate amounts of this seaweed if we are going to use it in commercial to feed all the cattle, the beef and dairy cattle as an example, because
that could be another sustainability issue, right?
Yeah, the sustainability issue. The Australia has tried growing those seaweeds indoors and near shore cultures, but they are still kind of trying to do that, seems like. And but again, the seaweed has high water content. So if you want to transport and you make it a feed supplement, you have to dry it. So the drying can also affect that active ingredients, the active. So that those are the other challenges, you know, post-harvest processing and how that processing going to affect that active ingredient. And the other challenge I see is that because all the seaweed utilized in the research is coming from wild, but we don't know that the same species are compatible to grow in indoor cultures. Maybe the varieties of species that is compatible with those culture conditions, you never know whether they have enough power to reduce or enough concentration of that bromoform. So that is why I think recently the people who are conducting research on seaweed get together, and I think they had a discussion about how to go forward with seaweed, and they concluded that the most pressing research need at the moment is to screen all the seaweed species for their active ingredient concentration and filter and select some species and then see which species is more compatible to grow in that artificial culture conditions.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
It seems like just about with everything that once you start digging in, it gets really complicated, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to the audience questions, and there's one been posted so far, and I encourage others to post their questions as well. So this one is from Van Godbold. It's would you please compare ruminant animal emissions for grain-fed versus pasture grass-fed animals?
Okay. So this is a great question, and also touching the basic principles of nutrition and methane production, the biology, which is, I really like think whenever we can go back to our basics and explain things. So, and then again, the grain as a source of starch, pasture and grass, the source of fiber. So the fiber, the fermentation of fiber produce more methane per unit weight than fermentation of starch. So therefore, emissions per unit weight of feed or unit weight of, we say, dry matter intake is the methane emissions is going to be greater for grass-fed animals than grain-fed animals, okay? So, but if grass-fed animals is going to eat less than grain-fed animals, either grain-fed animals going to produce more methane, or there won't be any difference. But per unit weight basis, the pasture-fed animals is going to produce more methane per kilogram of feed or kilogram of dry matter they consume compared to the grain-fed animals.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks for clarifying. Okay, there's a couple more questions that have come in. So there's some concern just kind of looking at holistically the sustainability component of livestock production. So if there's, you know, in the confinement situation, you know, how rampant is disease and how does that affect the efficiency of production? And how do you combat that if disease is a common issue, or prevent it through antibiotics and hormones? And kind of bringing it back to our focus, how does that affect then the efficiency of the production in terms of overall you know, energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, it's again another great question. which touch the efficiency. Yes, diseases is because when we increase the productivity, that means production per animal, genetically the productivity most of the time negatively related with animal fitness. That means the ability to fight against the diseases. So we also see increases in disease prevalence for like metabolic diseases like milk fever, and then also other infectious diseases like mastitis when it comes to dairy cows, for example. And then the same time, we have some challenges now because the limited use of antibiotics because of the antibiotic resistance, which is another environmental concern. So, and again, if you go back to feed additives, and actually currently the feed companies produce different kind of feed additives. Most of the time, they are trying to replace antibiotics. For example, phytogenic feed additives are kind of, we see more and more phytogenic feed additives coming to the market, claiming that they are good replacement of antibiotics. Mm-hmm. So some have shown promising results, some have not, unfortunately. So, but that is not something we have forgotten, that this the increased disease prevalence associated with high productivity that would ultimately offset some advantages of improving efficiency, for sure. But at the same time, that is something we also we have also recognized as animal scientists and working with the industry to find solutions. Yes.
Got it. Okay, another question from the audience. Does incorporating more nutritious feed for livestock cost more money and water to use? How does it affect the price of the animal product? And, there are subsidies that help cover those costs. Is it possible for animal agriculture to be profitable without government subsidies? So several levels of questions there. And that first one, of course, is kind of the focus of your research and expertise.
Yeah. Yes. Again, for example, we just discussed that the fermentation of starch produce less methane than fermentation of fiber. And then fiber is much cheaper than starch, like the forage is cheaper than grain, or the we call concentrate. So the dietary modifications, for example, increasing starch or concentrate content at the expense of forage, or increasing fat content, which also has a negative impact on methane emissions, they all cost money. Can be expensive. So that is why either government or the industry individually or together have to come up with some incentive system for the best management practices. It can be dietary modifications, it can be manure management, it can be the crop and soil management that the fields produce in animal feed, like corn silage, soybean, can be any component. The farmers who are trying to minimize emission has to be rewarded in some way. I believe that our discussion about carbon markets and those kind of provide some solutions and kind of stimulate farmers. Farmers see some light at the end of the tunnel because of those activities, and that would promote more utilization of good management practices, even though they are going to be expensive. At the end of the day, the farmers will find some way to cover those costs. So I think in the future, there should be a program to reward farmers for doing that, if we want to keep farmers in animal agriculture.
Gotcha.
future. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I'm kind of curious, just, how pervasive are these discussions within the industry, and especially say compared to 5-10 years ago? Of course, there's been some high level announcement with the, the American Dairy Council pledging to be, net zero, and some of the bigger companies having climate and carbon pledges. So what are your...
I mean, I think you also already provide the answer because now the industry is talking more about the sustainable goals, right? For example, recently feed company contacted me, and they found that I have done some work towards greenhouse gas emissions, and they say they have products, but they are not their main effect. They are not directly affecting methane emission, but they want to test. They want to see whether they speculate some impact. They want to quantify that effect, because that indicates that industry is more its concern, consider not only the production, also any impact on the environmental sustainability. So that indicates that industry has some more conversation. Maybe they have talked about in their board meetings as well. They are just now going out and searching for researchers to help them to do that, right? And then, if you Google, there's some sustainable initiatives in the industry, you find a lot of examples now. Cargill's, McDonald's, they have started some prototype carbon credit programs with few farmers, with expectation of going to a broader program in 2022. The California is kind of leading that kind of effort. So overall, yes, compared to 10 years ago, we had a lot of discussions about that in the industry.
Got it. Okay, another question from Zach Simpson. Is pre-fermenting animal feed a possible tool for reducing greenhouse gases, so that maybe fermentation is controlled and the gas is captured before giving the feed to an animal? And then ends with saying, don't know if pigs like kimchi though.
We do. For example, when it comes to feeding cattle, we pre-ferment.
Okay.
Feed for making silage.
Right.
Making silage is we ferment the forage. We utilize most of the sugar in the forage for that fermentation. So it's more like we make a pickle out of forage through that fermentation process. And actually, that will increase the palatability and also increase the digestibility too. So that is when we feed corn silage compared to, for example, grass hay, we get better yield.
Okay.
Even grass silage versus grass hay, you better yield because of the palatability, and it improves the feed quality. Improving feed quality is it's a foundation to improve feed efficiency. Feed efficiency is it's a major part of productivity. That means we are going to have less animals and then less emissions as well. Yeah, that's a good idea. But we have been doing that for years. Maybe we can go further, maybe more innovative, and maybe develop new technologies in that direction. But it is not totally new to at least for the cattle industry.
Gotcha. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about what the greenhouse gas emissions associated with ensiling are. Do you know anything about that?
I think I saw somewhere somebody has touched that, but I do not have my clear idea about. That's interesting. Yes.
I need to look into that more. Okay, another question here from Cooper Hess says, is genetic research to reduce methane production viable, or is it the most efficient way to proceed, or too complicated, expensive, and time consuming?
Yeah, the genetic research, as far as I know, they select animals for indicator traits, which is the feed efficiency. So the feed, they found a significant genetic correlation between feed efficiency and negative correlation. If feed efficiency is high, the methane emissions is low. They are basically trying to select animals with high efficiency, assuming that would decrease the methane emission. But those relationships are again not consistent from system to system to the experiment to experiment. So, I mean, that is one major conclusion that very recently published paper reviewing all those research efforts, like the relationship is not still clear.
Okay.
So yeah, maybe they need to go to another indicator. Yes, it's expensive and time consuming, but I think they still kind of continue to they have not given up, it seems. So they continue to do it in an effective way, I believe. But I'm not part of that kind of research, but that's what I heard. Yeah.
Okay, got it. And then we have another question that's, a life cycle question saying, is it feasible to feed livestock more efficiently for the growing population versus thinking about direct consumption of the crops by people? And what would be the, methane balance associated with that? And then, of course, there's the nutrition issue that's linked in with this discussion as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an option. I'm not sure it's a viable option because I think the protein going to play a huge role in answering that question. Not only the amount of protein, the quality of the protein. Because if you consume 100 grams of animal protein versus 100 grams of a plant protein, first thing is animal protein is going to be more digestible than most of the plant protein, almost all the plant protein. I mean, like among the plant protein, soy protein is considered one of the best proteins. And then that is one thing. And then after absorbing, because the protein is digested to amino acids, so then amino acids are absorbed into the blood, and then the organs and tissues utilize those amino acids. And then again, the animal proteins provide all the essential amino acid in adequate quantities. But when it comes to plant proteins, there's always, most of the time, there are limitations. Okay, so to minimize those limitations, either you have to double the amount of protein, and also you have to mix and match different type of protein. It's so that would demand the production of more plant protein anyway to get the required amino acid, to meet the requirement of amino acids. So yeah, it is an option, but I feel like complete elimination of animal protein would not provide a very sustainable solution. Actually, there is a paper by Robin White at Virginia Tech and Mary Beth Hall at USDA Maryland. They together publish a paper that addressing consequences of complete removal of animal protein. I think I don't remember all the conclusions. They have some scenarios and looking at how much protein you need produce to meet the human amino acid requirements. So I think I can suggest that paper to get more insight into that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you for taking on that question and all of the questions that I've asked of you and the other audience members. That was really helpful, and I've learned a lot. Like I said, as soon as you start digging into some of these topics that you hear about in the news, all of a sudden it gets way more complicated. And so it's so useful to have an expert help us understand how these issues are connected and just understand better, what data are out there and the quality of the data. So thank you so much, Dr. Appuhamy. I'm going to share a couple of slides as we close this out. And let's see, where'd my slides go? Shoot, I had that right in front of me, and now of course it's disappeared on my computer. Here we go. All right, so this is Conversations About Carbon, where we talk about carbon reduction, reducing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, as well as opportunity to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in some ways. So we want to hear from you in terms of the kind of topics that you would like to hear about, or if there's specific experts you would like to hear from, please submit your ideas. You can do so at this little tiny URL, or take a picture with your phone and submit it, and it'll go to the smart sheet where we'll see them, and we'll try to arrange guests, experts that can talk to the issues in a really deep way. And our next conversation about carbon is going to be Wednesday, January 19th at noon. Michael Wang, who's the Senior Scientist and Director of the Systems Assessment Center of Energy Systems at Argonne National Lab, will talk about life cycle advances in the Corn Belt. So a lot of the questions we got today touched at least in some way on life cycle assessment. So we'll dig deeply into that. And I don't have a slide for it yet, but the February Conversations About Carbon will be with Dr. Kelly Bergman, who is associated with the Midwestern STEM Hub, and she's going to help us understand geological carbon sequestration in a deeper way. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Appuhamy, for taking our questions and interpreting all of the complex data and concepts and principles in this space. I learned a lot.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, awesome. Everybody have a happy holidays, and we'll see you next year.